What is the difference between a habit and a custom? A habit is a repetitive act performed usually by an individual or a group, such as wearing jeans every day. A custom is the frequent repetition of an act to the extent that it becomes characteristic of the group or of the people performing the act. What is folk culture and what is popular culture or pop culture? Folk culture is traditionally practiced primarily by smaller groups living together in isolated rural areas. Folk culture is known to be originated anonymously and has unknown dates, but it is known to have multiple hearths. Its diffusion is known transmitted from one location to another, and it is also known to be on a slower and more smaller scale. Its distribution is a combination of local and physical and cultural factors and influences the distinctive distributions. Now we have pop culture. And what is pop culture? Popular culture is basically found in larger societies that share certain habits, and despite the differences in personal characteristics, its origin is typically traceable to a specific person or group or corporation in a particular place or area. Its diffusion is it typically spreads through a process of hierarchical diffusion. Its distribution is that the distribution is influenced by the ability of people to access different sources such as the internet and other like cell phones and computers. One thing about pop culture are cell phones, and the percentage of Americans owning a cell phone or a smartphone increased in 2011 and in 2016, and today now more than 90% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 have cell phones and computers. Another factor in pop culture that is spread worldwide and could be found anywhere is social media and the impact that it has on it. Not every country or state or place has the same platforms as other countries, but it is still a pretty big platform as social media is.
Music was invented in China 2687 BCE. They cut bamboos and it made a sound that was unique and resembled the call of the phoenix. The stories were commonly about life, birth, and death. The oral tradition of folk music was that it was passed down verbally from generation to generation and was learned by listening. The creators of folk music was unknown, and it was a collective ownership instead of it being attributed to one composer. This reflects that folk music or folk culture usually have an origin that's mysterious and unknown. On the other hand, popular music originated from 1990s in Europe and North America. It started diffusing when radio networks were used and were broadcasted to soldiers and citizens during the World War II. Instead of the music being like folk music where it was traditional and reflected of life and its values, popular music was created for appeal and profit and was usually written by identifiable individuals or teams. Popular music was developed alongside radio, records, TV, and now digital platforms. They were often influenced by folk and classical traditions, but they were incorporated more in a modern style. The media of popular music was spread via radio, television, internet, and streaming platforms. It was easily crossed by borders and was appealing to international audiences. It was youth and trend-driven, which means it was quickly adapting to cultural and fashion changes in the world. The origin of soccer was that it originated from England in the 11th century. During those times, villagers and soldiers played informal and often violent games in fields or streets. These early versions were community-based and had few rules, fitting the definition of folk culture, which is local, traditional, and passed orally. Soccer spread from England to other countries via colonial-influenced trade and diplomacy. As locals adopted to the game, it spread organically from one person to another in cities and towns. Soccer clubs and leagues were formed in schools, factories, and communities. Thanks to relocation diffusion, immigrants brought soccer with them when moving to new countries, helping it take root in places like Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Due to the high popularity of soccer, TV broadcasts, the internet, and social media have turned soccer into a global pop culture phenomenon. International events like the FIFA World Cup spread soccer's popularity worldwide. Now, thanks to commercialization, soccer today is a billion-dollar industry with professional leagues, sponsors, and global fandom. Soccer stars are pop culture icons, and merchandise is mass produced for worldwide audiences. Clothing in folk cultures, including shoes, often reflects the local environment and availability of products. For example, in snowy or cold regions, people wore fur-lined boots or felt shoes for warmth. In hot and dry climates, people may wear open sandals that were made of leather or plant.
Chapter 4 and key issue 3, why is access to culture unequal? So it talks about electronic diffusion of culture, which it talks about why popular culture is a big obstacle with the internet and TVs and stuff, because lots of countries don't have it. Well, not anymore, but lots of countries didn't used to have it because of things like internet access. So it talks about in 1995 how most countries did not have internet service at all. So it was US about 63%, and then in between 1995 and 2000, it increased rapidly, pointing to like 9% of the world to like 44% of the world. Diffusion of late 20th century. So it brings up how between 1995 and 2017 how TVs and internet diffusion has increased, and there's tables that show like the changing distributions of TV from 1954 and 2005, and there's a big change in the numbers, and also the changing of distribution and diffusion of the internet from 1995 and 2017. The topic is social media and interconnectivity, and it talks about Instagram, how it's made by a bunch of Harvard University students, and how it started in the US in 2008, and it spread around the country rapidly, which it's continued to use in like the United States, but has like decreased like by a lot. And then it talks about the diffusion of Instagram, which was about the same thing as Facebook, but what happened is it's like mostly run by people from America, like people like Taylor Swift, Kim Kardashian, Ariana Grande, stuff like that. There's Twitter, which is the United States was the leading source of Twitter and Instagram in 2017, but now it's actually been India these past recent years. But Americans still dominate like all the most famous Twitter posting by famous people, as I said before. Challenges in accessing electronic media. So it talks about how some places have banned technology or banned websites that they can't see from certain countries, like phone or place in general. And it talks about how 65 countries are quote unquote free on internet access, and technically you can see whatever you want on social media. But when like they dove deeper into it, it was actually only 19 out of the 65 countries that are actually quote unquote free, which goes into banned technology, or how some countries like ban technology content, where certain websites are like completely blocked off a person's phones from a certain country, and how it's mostly because like the big countries that are like usually on the internet are Japan, the United Kingdom, and US, and people they don't want people to go away or find ideas. Onto that, the 3 reasons are political content that expresses the views and like oppositions to a country, like oh this is what bad about your government, this is what good about your government. It also talks about social media, social content, so like sexuality, gambling, and like drugs, illegal drugs and alcohol, which can like influence people and also can be offensive. And lastly, it talks about security content, like things like guns and stuff like that. Then it talks about violated user rights. So in some countries, like people are being harassed or put to jail by like unacceptable authorities. Like governments are finding like people that do stuff like, oh, this is against the government, like oh the government's bad for you, this, that. This is what I think. They will put them in jail, like they will beat them and stuff like that. Or being like, oh, like LGBTQ, they'll do stuff like that. Chapter 4, key issue 4, why do cultures face sustainability challenges? So it talks about Amish migration, which is an example of folk culture. Rooted in tradition, they don't do things like use technology, and they embrace rural living. But a big part of their like preserving their identity is migration. Migration pressure rises in settlements like Pennsylvania and Ohio, and Amish families migrate to other places like Missouri, Kentucky, and Mexico because there's cheaper land, less regulation, and more importantly, there's more like isolation from other cultures. The relocation diffusion helps their culture traits. Even if they move, like they still have their identity from the language out of the 65 countries that are actually quote unquote free, which goes into banned technology, or how some countries like ban technology content, where certain websites are like completely blocked off a person's phones from a certain country, and how it's mostly because like the big countries that are like usually on the internet are Japan, the United Kingdom, and US, and people they don't want people to go away or find ideas. Onto that, the 3 reasons are political content that expresses the views and like oppositions to a country, like oh this is what bad about your government, this is what good about your government. It also talks about social media, social content, so like sexuality, gambling, and like drugs, illegal drugs and alcohol, which can like influence people and also can be offensive. And lastly, it talks about security content, like things like guns and stuff like that. Then it talks about violated user rights. So in some countries, like people are being harassed or put to jail by like unacceptable authorities. Like governments are finding like people that do stuff like, oh, this is against the government, like oh the government's bad for you, this, that. This is what I think. They will put them in jail, like they will beat them and stuff like that. Or being like, oh, like LGBTQ, they'll do stuff like that. Chapter 4, key issue 4, why do cultures face sustainability challenges? So it talks about Amish migration, which is an example of folk culture. Rooted in tradition, they don't do things like use technology, and they embrace rural living. But but a big part of their like preserving their identity is migration. Migration pressure rises in settlements like Pennsylvania and Ohio, and Amish families migrate to other places like Missouri, Kentucky, and Mexico because there's cheaper land, less regulation, and more importantly, there's more like isolation from other cultures. The relocation to fusion helps their culture traits. Even if they move, like they still have their identity from the language and the way they dress. In India, challenging cultural values. So in India, marriage has been long tied to folk culture and with arranged unions and considerations and elaborate rituals. But now things like dating apps and like open to the world, that values are being challenged. Like the generations are shifting towards popular culture ideas, like actually being in love and actually being compatible. This culture shift is more common in cities where people are more like exposed to the global norms than what their culture is. Cultural convergence. So cultural convergence is like cultural blending together, not vanishing. So if there's a culture in like China or Japan and it spreads across the world and it happens more across the world, more popular, that's cultural convergence. Like the culture from that country didn't go away, but it migrated to other places in the world. Cultural convergence happens when ideas, habits, or values spread and also overlap. It happens by things for globalization, technology, media, and also migration. Over time, local customs mixed with global influences, and they're led to shared experiences that feel familiar no matter like where you are. Then there is uniform cultural experiences, and this is when people are looking and acting the same at a different place. So when you land in a new country and you land, the first thing you see are like Starbucks and Subway and Zara. Like these are standard environments to create comfort. But internet and communicating are blending. Like the same memes, trends, and songs are shared from all over the world, and culture is like spread everywhere. Golf. So golf is not only a sport, but it also shows how cultural convergence can also have many shapes and landscapes and also lifestyles. So it originated in Scotland and has become a global thing. It's now played over in 200 countries and often has a status symbol. It happens in places like the UAE or China. Golf represents modernization and also luxury, but there's a flip side. Golf builds courses and large amounts of land and water. All sport like brings people together. It also can affect the local needs. Urban/rural area differences. So they aren't just divided by buildings, they're divided by culture. Like in urban areas, they're like diverse, fast, and they often shaped by popular culture. Like you see lots of change in fashion, food, and also the norms. But in rural areas, they tend to hold a stronger things of like tradition, religion, and community plays a big role in daily life. Like they mostly focus on agriculture, family, and long-standing practices. All in all, the last thing that this chapter and key issue talks about is the cultural differences and the individual scale.